Great, thank you so much for having me. Okay, perfect. So, yes, I am Sally Hurst. I'm joining you from Australia today. I'm on my mum's farm, which is on Aboriginal country known as Ngunnawal country, near our nation's capital of Canberra. So, Sydney is not the capital, just FYI. So, for my research, I look at the interactions between humans and fossils, both modern humans as well as throughout time and in different ancient civilizations. And I'm able to do this primarily because I am both a trained archaeologist and paleontologist, which generally means that when I work in museums and speak to the public, I'm pretty much constantly saying, like, oh no, archaeologists don't actually dig up dinosaurs, that's someone else. But made all the more confusing because I dig up all of the things. So just in case you are like, what is the actual difference? Paleontology is the study of fossils and dinosaurs, life from a past geological age. So generally tends to be thousands to millions, sometimes billions of years old. Whereas archaeology is a little bit younger, it is the study of ancient or past humans and the remains that they have left behind. And so, in terms for me, I've got an even longer time scale of history to work with when I study these two different parts. So, I am an adjunct fellow, so a researcher with Macquarie University in Sydney. I did an undergrad in paleobiology and Egyptian archaeology in that degree, and then for my Masters of Research, pivoted more into Australian and Aboriginal archaeology, paleontology, and science communication to the public. I'm also an educator at the Australian Museum in Sydney, so I'm often out on the floor talking about fossils and dinosaurs. The last few years, I've also been able to head out into the field in Dinosaur Provincial Park, and this year as well up at Grand Prairie too, generally under the unofficial supervision of Dr. Phil Bell from the University of New England. And I also created something called the Founder Fossil Project, which is what I'll chat a little bit about today. So I thought I'd first also give you a bit of a rundown on some of my favourite Australian fossils. I think Canada and Alberta especially definitely has a monopoly on cool dinosaurs. So I've brought in some other cool fossils we have that you don't have. So just to bring us up to par as well. And then I'm also going to share some of my research on these interactions over time that humans have had with fossils, chat a little bit about the fieldwork that I do get to do in Canada, and then finish off with some new research as well that hopefully you guys will also be able to participate in. And so introducing the Found a Fossil project, this was something that stemmed from my Masters of Research at Macquarie, and it was based around this question of what should you do or what would you do if you ever found a fossil? Now, many of the people in Australia who are finding fossils are not scientists. We don't have a workforce of paleontologists in the same way that Canada does, mainly due we don't have the population. Our fossil sites are in the middle of nowhere, often very far away from any amenities or city centres. So a lot of the time people who find this stuff are farmers, miners, bushwalkers, retirees who are out on a caravan trip, for example. And a lot of the time they have no idea what to do if you do actually discover something. And the things that you might find in Australia are incredibly varied as well. We have fossils that span from the very beginning of life on Earth all the way to massive megafauna creatures that existed at the same time as Australia's First Nations people. So one of these enormous creatures was the largest marsupial or pouch animal to ever live on Earth. This is called the Diprotodon, two front teeth, and it's basically a wombat-like creature that was about the size of a car. And these did live at the same time as Aboriginal people. We don't know if they were hunted or if they were kind of like bears that you just avoid and let them do their own thing. But something this massive could definitely do some damage. And we have hundreds of skeletons of these spread all around the country, even things like trackway sites as well. So they're a definite fan favourite in Australia. Going back a little bit further in time, this is a site in central Western New South Wales, so the state where I am from, that was discovered by a farmer, and he'd actually accidentally run his truck over this fossil site a number of times before he got out to take a pee or something and looked down. It was like, oh, look at all these. And this site is incredible because there is soft tissue preservation of insects. Previous to this site being found about 2 or 3 years ago, Australia had about 4 fossils of spiders across the whole country, across all of time. From this site alone, we now have 13 new species of spider. And as you can see, the squishy bits are preserved, which is incredibly rare for bugs. My favourite fossil from this site is the one on the right-hand side, which is a sawfly. And the detail of, or the level of preservation is so fine on this fossil that when you look at the head of this fly under a microscope, you can still see pollen grains on its face. So maybe this is an indication that it was an active pollinator just before it died, but incredibly cool that we can get that level of resolution on something that is tiny. Going the furthest back we can in Australia to the Ediacaran and Cambrian, the Flinders Ranges is it's nominated as a World Heritage Site. Hopefully it gets in. But it has all of these incredible microfossils of some of the first and earliest life on Earth. And this is pretty unique to Australia. There's not many other places you can find stuff like this. And so we definitely hold our weight in terms of important fossils. When it does get to dinosaurs, however, we are nowhere near as rich in our dinosaur fossils as Alberta is, nor are we as lucky in the articulation that we have. A lot of the time our dinosaurs are found in places like this. This is Dinosaur Cove on the south coast of Australia in Victoria. And the bones are often pretty cemented into these rocks, and people have to spend the first 2 hours of the morning digging off this sand, which has come back up every single morning from the tides. Then they can actually get to the rock and hopefully there's something underneath. One of the most articulated specimens from Australian dinosaur paleontology is this articulated tail, which was found in these rocks. And a lot of these dinosaurs are very small ornithopods. They are little polar dinosaurs, as Australia was connected to Antarctica during this time. Definitely wasn't as cold as it is now, but it has led to some really gorgeous paleo art, including this one by John Conway, of this little ornithopod known as Lianalosaura, which has a crazily long tail. It's twice as long as the body of the animal. And so maybe they were these little signals, potentially feathered, we're not sure, to be a little signal in the snow during these polar regions. Most of our dinosaur sites, however, are, as I mentioned, in the middle of nowhere. This is a site that I often go digging in Lightning Ridge in Western New South Wales. And all of these holes in the ground are individual mines owned by just locals, really. There's not any big mining companies that are digging for stuff out here. But they are looking for opals, and the opal layer is about 18 meters underground. So you have to climb down a very rickety ladder with a little torch on your head to get to that 18 meters deep and then hope you find something. But the fossils that we find here are also made of opal. So they have these incredibly gorgeous colors. And Australia is one of the only places I think it is the only place on Earth where you can find vertebrate fossils preserved in opal. And so you can get little plant remnants, teeth from mosasaurs. We found, I think there was maybe a mammal vertebrate at one point. And this is a very cute, it's tiny little lower jawbone from an ornithopod. So these little leaf shapes are teeth. And the amazing thing about Lightning Ridge as well is that all of the equipment that is used is bootlegged from something that was not originally made for that purpose. So the miners there are incredibly inventive, and to break up the clay that often surrounds the rock and the opal, they get out all of the dirt and sediment from the mine and they put it in a modified cement mixer, pump it full of water, and that will break up all of the clay. So what comes out the other side is, if there is any opal, it's very obvious and you can just pick it out. But it means that many of our fossils that we end up finding are quite small because they've been through the equivalent of a rock tumbler. So incredible that fossils like this still exist with those kind of processes as well. In terms of where many of our other larger dinosaur species come from, again, in the middle of nowhere. This is out in Winton in outback Queensland, and most of the land out here is really crap farming country. So these might be 30,000 acre stations where thousands of sheep are run. And every now and then, a farmer will trip over a dinosaur bone and discover the next big thing. And so some of these dinosaurs found in these areas are things like sauropods, iguanodontids, ornithopods as well. And the fun thing about these three Australian species is that all of them were not found by scientists, and they were named after the member of the public who they were discovered by. So a nice little inclusion for those people. Now, in Australia as well, we do have 60,000 years of human habitation on this continent. Aboriginal Australians are the oldest living culture in the entire world, and they have the archaeological record to prove it. And so lots of the time, people who are out on the land and they find something, it might be a fossil, but it could just as easily be something like a stone tool. And so the Found a Fossil project wanted to ask, what are people doing when they find something? Are they doing different things for fossils versus Indigenous artifacts? Now, in Alberta, you guys have a great museum, the Royal Tyrrell, which has a very quick and easy website which says exactly what to do if you find something, here's who to contact, here's what the legislation says, and fingers crossed people either know about it or know about the museum enough that they can find this information relatively easily. In Australia, unfortunately, that is not the same case. Our fossil legislation tends to vary in every single state and territory. It varies depending on what land type you are on, and sometimes the legislation doesn't exist at all. In New South Wales, where I live, for example, those mining sites like Lightning Ridge, because those leases are essentially private property, there is no law to stop these miners from breaking up these opalized dinosaur bones or other fossils to sell them for jewellery pieces, for example. There are some government initiatives that are trying to make it better, tax incentives, etc., if you donate the fossils to a museum. But on the whole, the legislation and the protections are not there, and our museums are not integrated into the legislation either. So a lot of the time, there's no active advertising on, you can contact the Australian Museum or the Queensland Museum, where you can help identify things. We can send researchers out if it is something big or important. A lot of the time, it's just, oh, fingers crossed, they'll find us if they need us. But we have no actual evidence to say that people are finding museums as the source of information. And so how many dinosaurs are in someone's backyard or, squirreled away in someone's shed just because they didn't know who to contact? So when it came to creating the Found a Fossil project, I thought, what would someone Google if they were looking for this information? And that led to the name of the project. Now, while this was part of my Masters of Research, I was very aware of the fact that a farmer who has found a fossil does not want to read a 20,000 word document trying to dig through what am I actually supposed to do. So I decided to create a website which has state-by-state breakdowns on what to do, who you can contact, what museums are available for identification. So hopefully these finds, both for fossils and for Indigenous heritage, can be protected into the future. The actual data collection side of the Found a Fossil project was this big survey. The questions that Molly has used in her survey are actually the same questions that I asked, just I think without the Indigenous sections mostly. And so we're asking people, okay, you found something that you know is a fossil. Would you tell anyone, yes or no? Now, over 70% of people said, yeah, I'd tell someone. But when we started asking people, okay, who would you report to? The responses started to get a little bit more complex and messy. The survey as well, because again, I wanted to get outside of my network, I was speaking on radio, I was going to many regional and local museums, speaking at different conferences and seminars, trying to get published on government websites, a lapidary local newsletter and farming magazines as well. So anytime there was an opportunity for a person who was outside to discover something, hopefully they had seen the survey somewhere. And I ended up having people from all over the country reply with over 1,300 responses over the course of the 5 months that the survey was open. And as I said, one of the results that I want to share was what would stop you from reporting a heritage find? So there were separate questions for artifacts and fossils. And the top answer for fossils was that it may not be a significant find. I don't want to waste a paleontologist's time if what I found is just a rock. And it happens, but, just in case it is a dinosaur, we're happy to know about it. But the top answer for Aboriginal artifacts is that I do not know who to contact. Now, the reason I've highlighted this result is because in Australia, while Aboriginal cultural heritage also varies in every state and territory, it's also very vague and outdated and hard to find, there are dedicated departments of at least one guy who has a website, who has a government kind of backing to say, if you find something, this is what you should do. Here are the laws about Aboriginal cultural heritage. But even though those departments and those resources exist, they're obviously not doing a very good job at conveying that existence to the public when more people have said, I don't know who to contact about Aboriginal heritage versus fossils. So changing the legislation may not be the answer, but hopefully we can make it more accessible into the future. But how can we actually do that as well? Within my survey, there was an optional section where people could read or watch a social media post, a blog, a website, a brochure, or a video. They could opt in and provide some feedback on what they now think. Was it engaging? Was it informative? Do they need more info? But the most important question I asked was, if you originally said, no, I wouldn't report a fossil, well, have you since changed your mind after seeing what you can do? Now, for fossils, over 50% of people changed their minds, and for artifacts, it was about 40% as well. Now, obviously, these numbers can be better, but this was a low-budget, anonymous, 8-minute survey, and these percentages equate to over 100 people who may now report on a dinosaur they find in their backyard. So I would love to see what a museum-funded or a government-funded awareness campaign in this space could do to improve that protection and awareness of this heritage across countries as well. If you are interested in reading more about those results, it is in the Journal of Science Communication. But as I said, someone like a farmer may not know about peer review publishing. It is open access, but that's probably not the forum where they're looking for information. Now, in Australia, the best place to find Australians is the pub. So I've done a series of pub talks, of comedy talks in locations across New South Wales, trying to get this information in front of people like farmers, like bushwalkers, gardeners, anyone who might be outside. I've been able to work with ABC Science and do a number of podcasts and media interviews, again, trying to get this information out there. And my favourite part of the job has been going to a number of different events and speaking to schools and kids about what you should do if you find a dinosaur in your backyard. Now, one of the unexpected outcomes of the Found a Fossil project was that I now often will get people sending me photos of their finds. I'm by no means an expert, but I have a really good network of people I can phone, Phil Bell generally, to go, Phil, is this just a rock or is this an important fossil? One of the favourite finds that someone sent me was this classically shaped object. The person found this on a beach and thought it was a very particular part of dinosaur anatomy and included the scale for reference, which, to be fair, that's exactly the kind of photo we want. But I had to tell them, I'm so sorry, this is not a dinosaur sex organ. This is in fact just a rock. This is a concretion, just in a really interesting shape. But the point is, we need this curiosity in the public. We need these forums like Found a Fossil where people can go, oh, I don't want to get in trouble, but I really want to know what this is. Unfortunately, this time it was just a rock, but maybe next time it will be the dinosaur penis we are all hoping for. Again, soft tissue preservation is quite rare, so we found a belly button, we found a cloaca, maybe the dinosaur sexual organ will be the next find. When we start then thinking of finds that people have sent in that interact with ancient humans as well, this was one that was sent in to me last year, and you can see it's tiny, it's less than 2 centimetres, but this was found at an Aboriginal stone tool site, And the archaeologist cracked it open and, well, didn't crack it open, it was a flake from a stone tool, and saw this little fossil looking thing and was like, oh God, what do we do? Humans have been interacting with this, maybe accidentally, maybe on purpose, we're not sure, but also what is it? So this is a tiny little stem from a crinoid, so potentially more than 350 million years old. And yeah, it's just a really nice example of humans have been interacting with fossils, whether on purpose or by accident, for a really long time. Now, this also led into some newer research that I got to complete. I was invited to contribute to a special issue of geoconservation research by Mike Benton about the relationship between museums, fossils, and First Nations people. And as part of this research, my co-authors and I traced the interactions between humans and fossils over the course of human history. And so these are a few of my favorite examples that we talked about. So this is a reconstructed necklace of trilobites from Utah. And so American Indians apparently thought that trilobite fossils were a protective amulet against bullet wounds. And so they were thought to wear them around their neck in this kind of style. Going back to my ancient Egyptian roots, this is a fossilized sea urchin. Again, it's tiny. I was going to say it's only a little bit bigger than a 50-cent coin, but for Canadians, you probably have no scale of what that is. So it's only about this big. But the person who discovered this, an ancient Egyptian, I think about 3,000 years ago, thought this little fossil was cool. So they picked it up, they took it to a temple for safekeeping. So who knows, maybe the first museum. But they also, instead of a museum number, wrote their name on the bottom in hieroglyphs and where they found it. One of my favorite examples of this interaction, going back tens of thousands of years, is this stone hand axe from the UK, so in England. It's early Pleistocene in age, so about 700,000 years old. And while we can't definitively say what the intention of the ancient human was, to me it looks pretty obvious that this person saw this fossil in this rock and was like, I'm purposefully going to cut this stone tool around it. So whether it is collecting things for use or trade or protection or just to appreciate their natural beauty, humans haven't changed all that much over hundreds of thousands of years. Another wonderful outcome of this project was getting to interact with one of my co-authors, Steve Salisbury. He works in Western Australia with people like Richard, who is in this photo. And Richard is a law boss or cultural knowledge holder or elder from the Gullara-Baloo people near the Dampier Peninsula, so in the middle of Western Australia on the coastline. And there are thousands of dinosaur trackways in this area. And as you can see, he's sitting next to one. It's got 3 big old toes. Some of the other trackways at this site have been assigned to theropods. And I think the wonderful thing about this site is that these trackways have been part of the dreaming stories of this community for thousands of years. The sort of stories about them have been passed down orally for generations, and they are tied to an ancestor being known as Marala, or the Emu Man. And I just think it's such a nice connection that theropods who made these trackways are the original ancestors of all birds, including emus. And so what took Western scientists hundreds of years to kind of figure out that connection between birds and dinosaurs, maybe if we had listened to First Nations cultural knowledge a little earlier, maybe we could have made that connection a bit earlier as well. So again, the preprint for this paper is available online. The official version should be released very soon if you're interested in learning more. And I thought I would finish up with a brief interlude into the fieldwork that I also get to do alongside this research. So through a collaboration between the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, the University of Reading from the UK, led by Dr. Brian Pickles, and Phil Bell from the University of New England, they bring over a bunch of undergrad students from the UK to Dinosaur Provincial Park to complete the field skills component of their courses. Now, I'd done a little bit of field work in Australia before, and I harassed Phil and he let me come to Canada. Definitely has its own different environments and challenges. I grew up on a farm, so I'm used to snakes and rattlesnakes. I was the one with the camera who's trying to get so close, and people are like, oh, but they're so dangerous. But they also let you know where they are. Australian snakes don't do that. And Phil as well was Phil loves snakes, and so there was definitely a time on the dig where he found a garter snake, which are not venomous, or not badly anyway. And he's like, "Oh, Sally, here, pick this up." So if you ever go on a dig with an Australian, expect the unexpected. The other challenge that we had to overcome in the field was things like cactus. Taylor did not fare very well with cactus. He rolled under the only section of fence which had one on the ground. As you can see, he's being a pretty good sport about it. But one of the projects we get to work on in the field is the Kasky hadrosaur. This dinosaur is very special. It was discovered, I think, in 2020 or 2021 by Brian Pickles and one of his research assistants, Terry Kasky. Brian claims he wasn't lost, but he was looking for another bone bed he'd been to previously, and they went past this hoodoo, and this amazing dinosaur tail was sticking out of the side, and it had skin preserved. Due to the direction of the bones, they're hoping that the legs, the stomach, the head, everything else is still preserved inside the hoodoo, and hopefully it is basically a 3D mummified dinosaur with skin inside. Now, the excavations are being led by the incredible Darren Tenke. We've spent the last 2 or 3 years knocking down this hoodoo to try and get to the dinosaur level. Turns out that the orientation that they thought it was in was not quite right, so we had to knock down even more. And so this was it at the end of the 2024 season. I think Darren has estimated that we have moved about 300 tons of rock by hand. As it's in the provincial park, you can't really get a big dozer or something in. So Darren, Ian and Dawson would rappel from the top of the hoodoo in harnesses with jackhammers. We would then shovel out all of the rock, and hopefully, fingers crossed, next year we can actually get it out to the museum if it fits inside the door. Another amazing project that we get to work on are these multi-species bone beds. Dinosaur Provincial Park is quite well known for these big death assemblages of single species, so Centrosaurus, Styracosaurus, big ceratopsians, whereas we are looking at surface scatter and digging kind of on a smaller scale to see what else was in the environment. So the bone beds we're digging in are not really, they don't have any articulated bones. Everything's kind of been washed in together, but it gives us an excellent snapshot of what else was in the ecosystem. So this picture shows just things that we kind of collected on the surface at one of these bone beds. You've got, I think it's the end of a toe bone of a hadrosaur. You've got croc teeth and dromaeosaur teeth, turtle shells, croc scoots, random bits of bone. And it's really exciting to see all the different things that might come out of these different bone beds. On these digs as well, every now and then we'll get a call that, oh, we just need a few extra pair of hands because someone's made some amazing discovery. So we got to help jacket and excavate a tail club from an ankylosaur. It's got these massive lesions in it, so hopefully someone is researching that, but it's very cool to be able to be involved in these kind of discoveries. One of the really exciting finds from these multi-taxic bone beds was a little bone, you can see Caleb's holding it there, of a pterosaur. Pterosaurs have hollow bones, so it's very rare to actually find them, and especially when all of these bones that we're looking at have been mixed in together, unarticulated, it's a miracle that this one has survived, and even more so because it is a juvenile pterosaur bone. So Caleb has the adult version of this, I think it's a neck vertebra from an adult Asdarchid, and we found this tiny little juvenile one as well. So super exciting that we and these students as well, these undergrads, get to be involved in such cool discoveries. In terms of new research for me, I am still continuing to look at modern human perceptions of fossils, as well as that communication to the public as well. So I'm in the midst of a study which looks at what is the role of museums in communicating information about fossils to the public. How do paleontologists and other museum staff play a role in this communication? And how is the actual legislation that governs these fossils effectively communicated across different locations? So at the moment, I am doing a survey comparing Canada to Australia in places where we find vertebrate fossils. So if you are involved in museums or going out into the field, I'm specifically focusing on Alberta at the moment. You're a paleontologist, a researcher, you're an educator at a museum, anything to do with talking to the public or just fossils, please do get in touch because I'd love to hear from you and have your voice as part of this research. So if you do want to get in touch with me, there are many different ways you can do it. Just search Found a Fossil Australia and it should come up straight away. Thank you so much for listening. And if you do have any questions as well, let me know. Thank you very much.
All right, we just got a round of applause here. So excellent. And yeah, the floor is open to questions, and we can take questions from the chat as well. If anyone's got one. In the back there, yeah.
So I'm just wondering how much quantitatively on the research into the oral history collaboration have actually been looked at and incorporated into the afro.
Okay, so the question was how much work has actually been done in how much research has been done in Aboriginal oral traditions around fossils and how those were used, what they thought of them, that kind of thing?
Not much, honestly. The Broome Trackmaker site in Australia was probably one of the first that I heard about. I have no doubt that there are more all around the world, but I think First Nations people are quite rightly very hesitant to work with Western scientists. I think we all know there's been damaging history of colonial practices of taking this knowledge for our own use and not forming collaborative projects with First Nations people. So I think we need to build those relationships first, and then hopefully we can share these stories. Because I think as well, many paleontologists are very much like, well, I study dinosaurs. My stuff is 60 million years before any people got here. It has nothing to do with them. But I think including these First Nation stories, it weaves such a rich tapestry of the site. They don't have to compete against each other. They can really complement each other as well. I think as well that knowledge can give paleontologists so much perspective as well. I know that in Australia there's a site called Wellington Caves. It's where we find big diprotodon bones. It was a pitfall trap, but the local Aboriginal community has a story on the formation of those caves that a giant wombat dug those caves as their burrow. And so again, I think that's such an amazing addition that doesn't take away from the paleontology or geology of the area, but just adds a really nice human connection to it as well. So more needs to be done. We need more people in that space.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions?
How many paleontology museums are there in Australia?
How many paleontology museums are there in Australia?
This is an interesting question. So we have state museums. We have the Australian Museum in New South Wales, for example. It's not strictly a natural history museum or dinosaur museum because it covers all kinds of history and collections. In terms of paleo museums, there are definitely a few regional ones. I can think of probably 5 off the top of my head in kind of Queensland, New South Wales, where these dinosaur sites are usually. But a lot of the time they're run more as a tourist attraction than a research or collecting institute. So there's definitely some politics about who gets access to these collections, or is it just a tourist attraction? I think the tourism section is a great way to start and to get people invested, and then hopefully there will be enough funding down the line to make them into accessible research collections as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And, you know.
I was just going to ask, when you're out in the back beyond, because a couple of those pictures were like, there's nothing out there, so you're just flying in railroad trucks, and then you're staying in the heat, in the sand, in tents, and not very great accommodations. And everybody's doing it on a volunteer basis. But really, I mean, you're hundreds of miles from fresh water and anything other than a pit toilet.
I mean, it kind of depends where you are. So Winton, for example, where we find those dinosaurs, it is technically on someone's farm. So you'll often maybe drive an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, depends on the dig, to the site they are digging at. And then in the evening, you drive back to usually stay in like shearers' quarters or a shearing shed or something. You roll out a swag on the ground, and hopefully there's water and showers and that kind of thing. Other times you do have to cart in all of your own water. Winton as well, it's in the middle of nowhere. So often people will fly into Longreach, which I think is 2 or 3 hours away from Winton. hire a car, drive out to the site, stay for a week or two, and then hopefully they come back. In places like Dinosaur Cove in Victoria, there's more people around, but you have to, I'm heading there next February, that'll be my first time to visit, and they've tried to scare me off. They're like, you have to walk down 90 steps, you have to bring all of your tools and shovels, dig up sand for 2 hours, crack rock into sugar cube sized pieces, put it in your bag and cart it back up so we can prep it at the top in the middle of summer while in the intertidal zone, and you are camping as well, usually in a caravan park. There's enough supplies around that we can manage, but it's probably not something you'd want to be doing for more than a week or two.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions?
Do any of the states in Australia, do any of
Sorry,
the,
what was that?
do any of the states in Australia have similar legislatures such as Alberta, and that all of the fossils belong to the state?
Theoretically. So in South Australia, for example, I think there is one clause in legislation, I think it's probably their version of the National Parks Act, that says all fossils belong to the Crown. But they haven't specified, okay, who is the Crown in this particular situation? Is it the South Australian government? Is it the Australian government? Who do you go and donate, or who do you give these fossils of the Crown to? Is it the museum? Is it a heritage department? No one actually knows. So a lot of the time, the legislation, if it exists, it will exist for national park. It will say that fossils are protected alongside dirt and leaves and rocks and everything in a national park. They're often not awarded any significance of their own. Outside of national parks, fossils are often free game. There are no rules.
Thank you. Any last questions?
Sure, I'll jump in. So, Sally, you've clearly spent a lot of time thinking about fossil legislation, and I'm wondering if you could comment on what do you think is the purpose of fossil legislation? Like when people are writing a law to protect fossils, what do you think they should be aiming for?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think for me, the sentiment of this comes from it would be a very sad world without dinosaurs, for example. These are things that we want to pass on to the next generations. So all the stories that we enjoyed as kids growing up or visiting a museum and seeing these fossils, the next generations can also see those. So I think accessibility of the fossils and also research of them as well. I think there's so much knowledge of our past that can potentially help in our future, and also just because it's cool. But yes, I think it's the protection and appreciation of those fossils in an accessible way. And I think it's the accessibility part that we're honestly really lacking at the moment.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I think we'll end it here, but there's your emails up on the screen there. So if anybody has any other questions, I'm sure they're free to email you with them. And,
amazing. Thanks for having me.
well, thank you for joining us from all the way over there.
What time of day is it there?
Oh yeah, what time of day is it over there?
It is 3 p.m. in the afternoon, but on Saturday the 16th. So I'm a day ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Thanks, guys.